Aloha Algebra 1 students. This video is solving linear equations graphically. We're going to look at linear equations, absolute value graphs, and quadratic graphs. So this is what the first graphic organizer looks like, and you will need a pencil, a straight edge, and two different color highlighters. For this second graphic organizer, you're going to need a pencil, a straight edge, and four different colors. And then for our third one, you'll need a pencil, a straight edge, and three different colors. So go ahead and gather your supplies and get your graphic organizers, and let's talk about solving equations graphically. So when we're solving equations graphically, our goal is to solve for x by graphing and not doing anything else. Usually when I give you some kind of equation that looks like this in A, B, or C, we're trying to move the x's to one side and the numbers to the other side, and we're grouping like terms, and whatever we do to one side, we do to the other, and we're solving through that process. But when we're solving graphically, our goal is not to do any of that. Our goal is to graph the equations and find the answer. So before we actually get to graphing the equations, I just need to take you through some setup. So before we graph, we're going to be given an equation that looks like this: 3x plus 4 equals x minus 2. And we're going to take this equation and we're going to split the equation in half. So that's going to be our first step. We're going to split it in half. And we're going to create two new equations. One equation will be called f of x, and the second equation will be called g of x. Okay, once we have our two new equations, we're then going to graph the new equations. And then after we graph the new equations, we're going to identify the point of intersection. And so the point of intersection is where they cross on the graph. And from there, we can look at our x-axis and say, oh, this equation is equal to this, based upon our graphing and where it's graphed, or where it intersects on the x-axis. Okay, so let's look at A. And to split equations, again, the process is we're going to look at the equation. We're going to split it down the equal sign. This left side will become one new equation. This right side will become a second new equation. And they're going to be named two different names. Our left side will be called f of x. So f of x equals 3x plus 4. And our second equation is called g of x. And our g of x is going to be called the right side. So g of x equals x minus 2. Okay, let's go to B and let's try that out. Again, I'm going to take my long equation. I'm going to split it into two. And whatever is on the left side, I'm going to put in for f of x. So 2 minus 3x. And g of x is going to be negative 4x plus 1. Okay, go ahead and try this one on your own, and then we'll talk about it just in a second. Okay, you should have split your equation, and f of x is going to be equal to 5 over 2x, and g of x is going to be equal to x plus 6. So again, this is called splitting equations. We split it down the equal sign. We took the left and created an f of x equation. We took the right side and created a g of x equation. Okay, so go ahead and pull out your straight edge, your pencil, and your highlighter. So first, here is your equations. We have 5 and 4, and these are backwards, but it's fine. Let's start off with number 5. And again, we want to solve this graphically, so we're going to split the equations. I'm going to create two new equations. My f of x becomes 2x plus 3. My g of x becomes positive 5. So here's my left side, f of x, my right side, g of x. And now let's go ahead and graph it. Use one of your highlighter colors, and let's graph our f of x. So my f of x equation says I start at 3, and I go up 2 over 1, up 2 over 1, up 2 over 1. I'm going to connect these dots to make my line. And remember, we connect our lines all the way through the equation. And let's go ahead and graph g of x. G of x, as we can see, there's no x. So we know that there's no slope or zero slope. So this zero slope is going to be a y-intercept at y equals 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Use your second color. Let's go ahead and graph that y equals 5 and use your straight edge to draw our line straight across. Now again, we're going to find our solution from where they intercept. So the intersection is right here. And where does it coincide with the x-axis? It coincides at x equals 1. So what is the answer for this x? If I was to solve it computationally, I would get x equals 1. Okay, let's try the next equation. 3 of x plus 2 equals 2x plus 4. Again, I'm going to split the equations and created a new f of x and a new g of x. So f of x is equal to 3x plus 2, and g of x is equal to 2x plus 4. So let's use one color and let's graph our f of x. Our f of x tells us that we start at positive 2, and I go up 3 over 1, up 3 over 1, and let's connect our dots all the way through the graph. Okay, let's go to our g of x. Our g of x says it starts at positive 4, and it goes up 2 over 1, up 2 over 1. Now you can see that from this point up 2 over 1, it intersects right there with that point. I'm going to connect my lines, but I'm also going to identify that this is where they intersect because this is the point that they share together. And where does it hit on the x-axis? If I draw a line straight down, I know that this is x equals 1, x equals 2. So if I was to solve this equation computationally, the answer I would get is x equals 2. Okay, let's go to our next graphic organizer. And this is solving absolute value graphs. So we know it's an absolute value graph because number 1, it gives us the absolute value symbol, which is these two straight lines. And number 2, this V means that this is an absolute value graph, this V graph. So let's go ahead and take this equation and let's split the equation. So I've created my new two equations. F of x equals absolute value of x plus 3 and g of x equals positive 4. Now, we haven't exactly learned how to graph absolute values in Algebra 1, so I've graphed all the absolute value graphs for you. I've graphed it for you. So here, as we see an absolute value graph and an absolute value equation, I graphed all the f of x's. So here's my f of x equals x, absolute value of x plus 3. So we're only going to graph g of x equals 4. Now again, we know that there's no x there, so there's 0 slope. So we're going to go to positive 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's where it intersects, positive 4. And we're going to draw a straight line straight across with our straight edge and one of our colors. Okay, so where do these two graphs intersect each other? Or where does a red line cross our absolute value graph? It crosses right here at this point. And I'm going to draw an arrow down. And where is that arrow at? Here's 0, so negative 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, negative 7. So this would be the answer of x equals negative 7. Now this crosses actually in a couple places. It crosses here and it crosses there. So we need to also solve for the other side. So let's draw an arrow down to the x-axis. And where does that hit? That hits at x equals positive 1. And so if I have an absolute value graph, I will almost always have two answers because it crossed through 2 points. One there and another point here. And where it coincides with the x-axis is going to be the x answers for this equation. Okay, let's go on to number 9. Number 9, again, I'm going to split this into two equations. My f of x is equal to 3 times the absolute value of x. And the right side is g of x equals 6. Again, my absolute value has already been graphed for you. So let's look at g of x equals 6. So we can see that the 6 is right there. And let's draw a line. And where does it intersect this graph? It intersects right here at this point and intersects it right here at this point. And those 2 points are at negative 2 and positive 2. So right here on the absolute value graph, our red line crosses right here, and that's at x equals negative 2. And then again, right there at x equals positive 2. Okay, I'm going to let you go ahead and do the second one. Go ahead and pause this audio or the video so that you can solve it on your own, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so you should have split the equation and created two new equations. This first equation is f of x equals absolute value of x minus 2, which is our left side. Our second equation is g of x equals positive 2, which is our right side. And again, I've already drawn the absolute value graph for you, so we're only going to graph g of x. G of x is at positive 2. So on my y, positive 1, positive 2, draw a line. Okay, so where does it hit our absolute value graph? It hits one time here, and that's at x equals 0. See how it hits right at 0? And the second time is right there. And this is going to be x equals positive 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. X equals positive 4. And so, again, we have two answers because it hit twice. Okay, let's go to the center of this graphic organizer. And in the instructions here, you can't see it here, but it says this graph is negative 3x plus 1. Negative 3x plus 1. You can see that it started at positive 1 and went down 3 over 1, down 3 over 1. And so as we're looking at each of these equations, we can see that the f of x, again, has already been drawn for us. So we're going to split the equations. We're going to draw in the g of x. And then we're going to find the solution on the x-axis. So for each of these A, B, C, D, make sure you have 4 different colors. And let's go. Okay, so first off, let's look at each of these, and let's go ahead and write in the f of x and g of x for all of them. For f of x and g of x. Start with A, and I'm going to split this in half, and I'm going to get f of x equals negative 3x plus 1, and g of x equals positive 4. For B, I'm going to get f of x equals negative 3x plus 1, and g of x equals to negative 5. C, f of x equals negative 3x plus 1, and g of x equals positive 1. And D, f of x equals negative 3x plus 1, and g of x equals negative 2. Okay, so now that we've split all of our equations, let's use different colors. For this first one, I'm going to use purple. And I'm going to graph g of x equals 4. So I know that it's a 0 slope, so I'm going to go up to positive 4, and I'm going to draw a line right there. Use your straight edge, go to positive 4, draw a straight line straight across. Now let's identify, where did these two lines cross? These two lines crossed right here, and it hit at x equals negative 1. And so my answer for this equation is x equals negative 1. Okay, let's go to the second one, pick up a second color, and I'm going to highlight my g of x equals negative 5 with with a different color, and I'm going to graph it. So this is at negative 5, so I'm going to walk down the y-axis and graph right there at negative 5. And where does this g of x equals negative 5 hit our other graph? It hits right here. It hits at that point, and it's going to be at x equals positive 1, positive 2. So this answer here is x equals 2. Okay, grab your third color. Let's go to our next g of x. G of x equals positive 1. I'm going to use orange. I'm going to highlight my g of x. And I'm going to go to g of x equals 1 right here. And I'm going to graph a line straight across. And then I'm going to identify, where does it cross the line? It crosses the line right there. And it crosses at x equals 0. And then our fourth practice problem is g of x equals negative 2. I'm going to highlight this with the fourth color. G of x equals negative 2. I'm going to go down to negative 2, draw a straight line straight across, and say, where does it hit our linear graph? It hits right there. If I was to go up to the x-axis, it would be x equals positive 1. So my answer here is x equals positive 1. Okay, how you doing so far? Okay, we have one more section of this graphic organizer, and it's going to be this bottom one. So I'm actually going to have you pause this and do it on your own. And again, I expect you to split the equations and show the two new equations. I expect you to graph the g of x and then graph where it hits on the x-axis and then also the answers. And again, as you can see, this graph of absolute value x minus 4, it's already been graphed for you. And so in A, B, and C, you're only graphing the g of x's. Okay, go ahead and pause the video, graph those, and then we'll talk about these answers. Okay, so you should be done graphing. And I'm first going to put all of my split equations there. Here is my A, g of x is equal to 5. Here is my B, g of x is equal to 1. And here's my C, g of x is equal to 7. Okay, let's use a color to highlight g of x equals 5. And let's graph g of x equals 5. And where does it hit my absolute value graph? It hits right there. It's right there. So my first answer is going to be negative 1, because x equals negative 1. And my second answer is x equals positive 9. So it hits two places. Okay, choose a different color, or you actually should have already done this. It's going to be g of x equals positive 1. I'm going to draw the positive 1 line. And I'm going to identify where is the point of intersection. Point of intersection is right there. Two spots. Here at positive 3 and at positive 5. So positive 3 and positive 5. So I'm going to write my answers as x equals 3 and x equals 5. And lastly, my g of x equals 7. Let's use a third color. And I'm going to graph the g of x equals 7 across. And where does it hit? It hits right there. And it hits right here. And where are those spots? It hits at negative 1, 2, 3, and 9, 10, 11. So negative 3 and positive 11. Okay. Did you get all of them right? If you didn't, make sure you're asking questions. Okay, here's our last graphic organizer. So this is what we call a quadratic equation or a parabola. P-A-R-A-B-O-L-A, parabola. And again, as you can see, this graph was notated by f of x equals x squared minus 4. And if you look at these three, A, B, C, they all have that. So again, I have already drawn the f of x's for you. So when we're doing this, you're just going to have to graph the g of x's. So we know the routine. Let's start graphing. In A, if I split the equations, this is what it looks like. X squared minus 4 and g of x equals negative 3. In B, f of x is x squared minus 4, and g of x is equal to 0. And C, f of x is equal to x squared minus 4, and g of x is equal to negative 4. So again, this is how I split all my equations. Choose a color. Let's go ahead and highlight g of x equals negative 3. And just like we did with both linear equations and absolute value equations, we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to go to g of x equals negative 3, and we know that's negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, and we're going to put a line straight across. And where does it hit? It actually hits where these two bumps are, or these two points are. And it's going to hit on x equals negative 1, and it's going to hit here on x equals positive 1. So our answers will be x equals negative 1 and x equals positive 1. Two answers because it hit in two places. Okay, let's go to B. B, we're graphing g of x equals 0. And I'm going to graph this right above the line. I'm going to use a second color. And I'm going to graph right above the line so that you can see where it hits. And it hits here at positive 2. And it hits here at negative 2. So again, because it hits twice, I have two answers, negative 2 and positive 2. And then lastly, we have our g of x equals negative 4. G of x equals negative 4 is right here. Let's use our third color. We're going to go straight across. And how many times does it hit our parabola? It only hits once. Because it only hits once, we are only going to get one answer. So where does it hit? It hits right here. Let's graph it all the way up to the x line. And that is x equals 0. And it doesn't hit any more parabola, so we're just going to leave it as that. Okay. Let's look on the bottom. And the bottom's going to give you the same graph, but we're going to look at different numbers. Okay, so let's go ahead and pause your video. Fill in. I want you to split the equations. And let's talk about graphing the g of x's. Okay, go ahead. Okay, so if you've unpaused, you should have all of these filled in. So g of x equals 3, g of x equals -2, g of x equals +6. And again, we're going to take these with a different color and we're going to graph them. So g of x equals +3. Here's +3 right here. I'm going to graph it. And let's look at where it hits. As you can see, it hits again in two different places, but it doesn't hit spot on a line. It actually hits in between our numbers. So this one hits at 2.5, and this one hits at -2.5. So when it does something like this, you just have to approximate it. And so again, I would still have two answers, but I'm going to approximate my answers to be -2.5 and +2.5. Okay, let's go to g of x equals -2. I'm going to go down to -2, 1, 2. Draw my line straight across. And where does it hit? It hits at this point and hits at this point. Let's draw our arrows up to the y-axis. And as you can see, again, it doesn't hit spot on a number. It's in between numbers. So because it's in between numbers, we're going to estimate. And here we have a -1.5x, so -1.5. And then x equals +1.5 right there. -1.5, +1.5. And our last one is at +6. So +6 is 4, 5, 6. It's going to be right up here. +6, as you can see, again, it doesn't hit spot on. It hits just on the other side of -3. And on this side, it hits just on the other side of +3. So again, let's just estimate. Because it's not spot on a number, we're going to estimate. So for this side, we'll say -3.2. And on this side, we'll say +3.2. Again, when we hit the graph, but it's not spot on the x value, we have to estimate it. And sometimes you are going to get decimals. So make sure that you're reading your graph carefully so that you can estimate it carefully. Okay, the last thing that we're going to talk about today is this last part on the bottom of our third graphic organizer that says use the graph of f of x equals x squared minus 4, which is this parabola, to help explain why the equation x squared minus 4 equals -5 has no solution. So let's take this equation and let's split it. Let's split it into an f of x on the left and a g of x on the right. So I'm going to have f of x equals x squared minus 4 and g of x equals -5. Now, we're going to do the same thing we did before. We know that this f of x is already graphed for us, so we're only going to graph the g of x. So g of x equals -5, -1, 2, 3, 4, 5 right here. Let's graph it in another color right here. Okay, and let's identify, where does it hit the parabola? Where does it hit our quadratic equation? As you can see, it doesn't hit the quadratic equation at all. It's too low. So if your g of x does not hit the quadratic equation or the graphed equation, any graphed equation, then it does not have a solution. So at -5, there is no solution. And why not? Because g of x does not intersect the graph of f of x. So there is no solution. Okay, that was a lot for today. If you have questions or concerns, make sure that you come in to get some clarification. Have an awesome day. Thanks.